I'm Mike Forsberg, and these are the Whooping Crane Chronicles. October 31st, 2019, Halloween. Convergence. I was in the middle of writing up a Whooping Crane story proposal at home. It was lunchtime, and I had just fired up the PBT website to look at our live feeds we have on the river, when Bryce Crone sent a text to me and Jeff Dale saying there was a family of whooping cranes on the live camera at the Crane Trust. He had a lock on them and was driving the camera controls, and there they were, ever moving as they do along the sandbars, poking and prodding in the sand, and fishing. For the first time in weeks, I had nothing on the calendar that afternoon, so I threw my camera bag in the truck and drove out to the river. Emma Brinley Buckley was watching in the blind already. It would take me an hour and a half to get there. Just as I turned off at the Alda exit, Bryce called me again and said they left the river and flew south out of sight. Damn. I went to the blind anyway and talked briefly with Emma, who had been observing and trying to record video. She pointed and showed me where they had landed roughly south of the river, so I headed back out and drove south, then east along Platte River Road that parallels the river, and looked for them. I found them, maybe 100 yards off the road, grazing in a weedy field corner along a crop field edge. They stayed about 10 minutes more, then flew north back to the river across from the VIP blinds where Emma still was and where I stayed until dark. These were 4 birds traveling together. 3 of the 4 were banded. 2 of them were in adult plumage, and 1 bird had no bands. The 4th bird was rust-colored, young of the year, and had telemetry, which meant Dave Brandt with USGS and Barry Hardup with ICF had this bird in hand up in Wood Buffalo this summer in early August during capture, and which also meant they know this family and its nesting territory, and then very likely their wintering territory, Aransas, and soon I'd be able to string together the entire migratory pathway story in between for these birds. The adult plumage bird without the bands appears to be a second-year bird. Probably they're young from last year, 2018, hanging on as long as it can before parents drive it out for good or it connects with other subadult birds. I'm only guessing here, but the behavior makes it a solid guess. It always is a short distance away from the parent and chick, occasionally allowed to mingle with the chick until one of the parents, especially the slightly larger one and more aggressive of the 2, green over white bands, will start walking straight towards it, then begin to flap, fly, run, and chase it away, sometimes even taking flight to do it. The young bird then seems to sulk away alone, but eventually works its way back towards the family, and the process happens all over again. Green over white seems to be their guardian, and yellow over gold, likely the female, was usually with the chick by its side, feeding, tending to its foraging, almost as if saying, "Look, do it this way," and "Hey, try this." It's hard to know what they are eating subsurface, but I watched them fish over and over again, pulling what looked like 3 to 6 inch silver slabs out of the water that shook in their beaks while trying to get away. The cranes would catch them, then put them down on the sandbar and poke at them several times, especially the juvenile, before finally swallowing. Bryce said earlier that he watched one with what looked like a large carp, which should be on the crane cam video if the recording was saved. I doubt this has ever been recorded before on migration, and underscores the importance of the aquatic world here to these birds as a healthy and vibrant food source packed with protein. It makes sense for these birds that eat crabs on the Texas Gulf Coast. I can only imagine what a rich tapestry and fish food source it must have been here in the prairies, braided rivers, and vast wetlands of the Great Plains 200 years ago. Another thing I bet has been seldom recorded is watching whoopers bathe, which I did record later in the day a couple hours before sunset. The adults did this together. The juvenile did not. They would launch themselves into a deeper channel and ride the current down 10 to 15 feet, dunking and flapping to fill all their feathers, then wading out at the shallow end of the sandbar and flapping themselves dry, then going up to the head end and doing it all over again. I also saw aggression I had never seen before between the juvenile bird and the mature, unbanded subadult when the parents were bathing. The two squared off and danced around each other in what appeared to be a brief squabble, probably arguing for who deserves the parents' attention. And I also saw aggression of another sort, very surprising, as a mature bald eagle flew overhead that they seemed to pay half-hearted attention to, that eventually landed on a sandbar 200 to 300 yards upstream. It seemed to be hanging out, or fishing, or maybe watching the whoopers fishing. Whatever the case, green over white did not tolerate its presence very long, as it walked a beeline straight towards the eagle as the rest of the family followed at a distance, and it eventually ran, flapping its wings and driving the eagle away. The eagle wanted no part of it and flew well downstream before landing back on another sandbar. About an hour and a half before sunset, the whoopers left the river again and flew south to Martin Meadow, out of sight. But then, as the sun was setting and sandhill cranes began cruising above the river in larger flocks, the family of whooping cranes flew in just below the treetops and lit on the river. They were the first ones down of any roosting birds that night and began drinking and preening. As they settled in, a flock of 20 or so sandhills circled in and tried to join them, but the whoopers did not oblige, calling out at them and spreading their wings in threat display as if saying, "Nope, not here." The juvenile sandhill, who at this point in its young life is still learning the rules, landed among the whoopers anyway, and the juvenile whooper chased it off immediately as it clumsily flew, ran, and half swam to the rest of the sandhills that had settled about 20 yards away. As daylight waned, a group of Canadas flew in and settled between the whoopers and the sandhills. Then a pair of great blue herons, one after another, settled just outside the ranks of the sandhills further upstream. When darkness began to fall, all the birds seemed to draw closer together, safety in numbers. A pair of coyotes had made a brief appearance along the south bank earlier when just the whoopers were on the river, and green over white certainly paid attention, his bill agape and showing it to the others before sending out a guard call. The coyote looked at the whoopers momentarily but seemed to have other plans upstream. Now I can hear them calling in the deep twilight far in the distance. There is no wind or clouds tonight. It's cool but not cold. Just the river and its song, and these timeless treasures. November 1st, 2019, All Souls Day. I was in the blind at 7:20 a.m., 40 minutes before sunrise. With binoculars, I could see the sandhills and whoopers roosting together on the river, ancient spirits stirring. The family of whoopers were on the downstream end of the roost, the subadult bird more in the middle. The herons of last night were gone, and I heard the Canadas leave as I was hiking to the blind at the first crack of dawn, which today was like a burning fire that grew on the southeastern horizon, swelling up under a thick-as-wool blanket of dark clouds that had kept a windless night warmer than usual. It would have been much colder under a blanket of stars. Shots fired from nearby waterfowl hunters a half hour before sunrise immediately put the cranes on alert bolt upright, especially the sandhills, who by now in their migratory lives navigating the Central Flyway know what those shots mean, having been hunted in every state and province down the Great Plains except Nebraska for decades now. A few more distant rounds of pops and the sandhills were off the roost and out to the safety of Martin's Meadow south of the river. No hunting there. The whoopers stayed on the river but began moving, foraging upriver and away from the sound of gunfires downstream. This morning, green over white was especially aggressive to the subadult bird, repeatedly chasing it not just away from the others but off the river completely. It flew south and immediately intercepted an incoming flock of descending sandhills that had been in the fields and were coming back to the meadow to loaf and feed. The young whooper landed with them, and I watched it for a while, mostly just standing there, occasionally foraging. But then the flock of sandhills it was with left again, and the young whooper just stayed by himself a few more minutes before trying to come back to the river. but green over white chased it off again for what would be the last time. When the young bird left the river this time, it circled and gained elevation quickly, flying higher and south over the meadow, then over the deep line of trees and the grain bins beyond. I watched its white wings get smaller and smaller until they evaporated into the horizon. The family was still on the river when I had to leave and get back home to Lincoln. Emma Brindley Buckley, who had joined me in the blind, called me 5 minutes later and said the Whooper family had flown off too, but their trajectory was low, so they probably ended up in the cornfield south of the river. The winds were picking up at 15 to 25 miles per hour out of the north, a good migration day if it was time, and the Platte had given this family what they needed to continue the journey. Godspeed. See you in Aransas. October 30th, 2021. It's been 5 days since I've been back home from Saskatchewan, but it seems like 5 weeks in my mind, desperately trying to hold on to the rhythm of that land and those memories, but they are fading. What's left to wrap up are half-written scribbles on scratch paper of things I remembered to write down in the moment but knew I couldn't complete them because I was too tired, too close, too held back from making sense of it all. So now I'm going to go grab those slips of paper out of the whirlwind in my mind and put them down here. And maybe I'll have enough clarity to come back to them someday with more of me in them. An injured snow goose and its mate uses whooping cranes for cover on the roost this early morning. Bald eagles here, an adult and 2 juveniles of the year, buzz snow geese roosting on the wetland. It becomes pandemonium quickly, and with enough birds in the air exploding from the surface, collisions happen, broken wings or other injuries result. For the eagles, it is then a matter of isolating these birds before going in for the kill. The snow geese and whoopers are roosting on the same wetland, but sequestered from each other. Although if the snows had their way, they'd roost with the cranes for cover, but the cranes will have none of it, always moving away. The problem for the whoopers in this is that in the evenings, they are settled on the roost usually 30 minutes after sunset, but the snow geese typically only start to come in then, swirling down in these massive vortexes. They like to land among the whoopers, but the next morning the whoopers are always walking away from them. So the injured snow and mate squatted in the whooper roost of a dozen or so birds, and the bald eagle adults would strafe the whoopers to try to get them to scatter. When that didn't work, the eagle would land on a hummock of bulrush, or root ball, or some other spit of dry land, and the whoopers would run at the eagle, charging at him with wings spread. Eventually, one of the whoopers got curious about one of the snow geese and looked at it a long while, then pecked at it. It hit its head a few times, not violently, but with enough force to be irritating. And once the whoopers left to go to the field, as they typically do each morning just before sunrise, the snow goose mate tried to coax its injured partner into the sky, but when the eagles came this time, it just had to fly away. Over the next half hour, all 3 eagles visited the injured snow goose, and while it put up a fight, it eventually died, unable to move, on its back, and drowned. The goose was gone when I returned to the blind the next evening, along with 2 other carcasses the eagles had collected that morning. It was heartbreaking to watch, but that also is the purity of life and death in the wild world, much more cut and dried than our own, and oddly enough, even beautiful. October 31st. Marlene's boss is Harry. He owns the motel. And his name really isn't Harry. He is Chinese and his name is longer. He's from a city called Tianjin, southwest of Beijing, closer to the coast. He told me because the last day I was there at the motel, settling up, he asked me about my home in Nebraska. He actually had me point it out on a map and said he'd like to visit it one day. Maybe on his motorcycle that he pointed to outside the window, with a big grin on his face. Harry is about my age. Well, maybe 5 to 10 years younger. And I think he has been here in Canada maybe half a dozen years, at least since he's owned the motel. Before that, he may have lived in Calgary for a time, where his wife and child now live. He's an adventurous soul, I can tell. Says he likes the people here. Says he likes the quiet, the wide open spaces. And all this he says in very broken English, but good enough to get by. In fact, I think mostly he likes the freedom, something I expect he didn't have in China, and maybe what brought him here. He said next summer he hopes to ride his motorcycle all the way across Canada to the Atlantic and back again. Then I told him about my trip I hoped to do following the Whoopers by airplane from Texas to Wood Buffalo. His eyes sparkled when he told me his plan. I imagine mine did as well when I told him mine. I told him there are 15 crane species in the world and at least 4 in China. He seemed to know that, but didn't seem to know we had them here. Before I left and had paid my bill, Harry leaned across the table slightly and pointed at me and said, "You do important work for the world. You photograph these big birds that migrate long distances across Asia and North America. You keep doing that." And he gave me 2 thumbs up. I shook his hand and walked out the door into the bright day. November 1st, 2022. Halloween Eve, Elsa and I raced out of our respective classes at Hardin Hall on East Campus, hopped into my truck, and we sped away, leaving school behind as we said to each other, "Going on a whooper hunt." This has been our tradition on Halloween since she was in late grade school, when she asked me if she could go watch cranes rather than go trick-or-treating. She never much liked Halloween or candy, so I took her to Roe Sanctuary that year, slid into the north blind with our snacks and drinks, and not expecting to see cranes at all, had a family of 3 whoopers fly right past our blind window at sunset, and that sealed our fate. We have tried to go see cranes on Halloween almost every year since. Elsa is 24 years old now, and most years we see them, and in the last handful, they have remarkably been whooping cranes. Admittedly, we have had some help. Since I started the Whooping Crane book project, I've had cooperation from biologist friends working with these birds, who have affixed them with telemetry, so while they never know exactly where they are at in real time, they have a pretty good idea of the last locations or the general flight path. I remember a few years ago going to the eastern sandhills to find birds north of Atkinson, and a couple years ago going up to sit on a bluff top to see a trio on the Missouri. And on another year, a year Elsa and I missed together, and I went solo, on the Platte River at the Crane Trust, in what would become the leading edge of a huge concentration of whoopers, over 60 plus in the Platte Valley by the first week in September. Now we were headed west on Interstate 80 to York, then north and east to a location where 2H, the chick from last year's church bird family, had pinged in on the map earlier in the day, entering Nebraska sometime in the last 24 hours and was headed south on migration for its first time alone. He had been with his parents, 12G, through spring migration but peeled off when they got to the boreal forest zone, and while Mom and Dad continued to Wood Buffalo to nest and successfully raise a new chick to fledge, 2H wandered around the ag line in the prairies and parkland zone all summer in Canada. He was one of the first birds to show up in telemetry moving south this fall, along with his near-winter neighbor, 4H, who already had made it to Texas and was exploring Chocolate Bay near Galveston. So Elsa and I wondered when we hit the York exit, is 2H still literally here, just off the interstate, or was he in flight at the time he pinged in? Was he solo, or was he with other birds? And if he is in the area, what does he look like? Is he healthy? Is he a he? Elsa had my laptop and we used her phone as a hotspot, so she could see the telemetry and navigate. 2H wasn't scheduled to ping in for another hour, and its last location was on the edge of a new housing development, so it must have been in flight. In this spot, there was one waterfowl production area wetland near Waco. Otherwise, it was simply a sea of corn and beans. We checked Waco first and saw nothing, so knew it had to have flown south, into the hilly country south of McCool Junction, at the very east end of the rainwater basins, or maybe smaller reservoirs and NRD lakes. We headed south on Highway 81 and waited for the bird to ping in again. Between McCool Junction and Geneva it did, and we were less than 10 miles away, racing sunset. It was on a small reservoir near Bruning called the Bruning Dam Recreation Area, run by the Little Blue NRD. Like most of the NRD reservoirs, they were established on drainages of tributaries to larger river systems as a means of local water storage, recreation, and flood control. There were two entrances, one on the upstream end and the other more established by the dam. We went to the upstream end first and didn't see anything. We both had binocs and good eyes, and we were good bird spotters. So I was quietly disappointed because I knew we had a good view of most of the entire reservoir except for a couple small contours hidden from our portion on the western shore. So we drove to the dam side and crested the hill and looked back to the north. And at first we didn't see them there either. Then Elsa said, "Dad, I got 'em." There they were, along the west shore, poking around ankle deep in the water and walking away from us maybe at 500 yards. We slid back down the dam and got into another position, less conspicuous, as they were still moving north in the direction where we had first looked. We got back into the truck and parked quietly next to some trees, and there they were again about 500 yards away, preening, obviously at their roost for the evening, standing on a little spit of mud among a watery savanna of flooded timber. Elsa and I watched them until it was nearly too dark to see. The moon was waxing, and Jupiter and her moons were shining in the eastern sky. A great horned owl was hunting in the darkness. There wasn't a drop of wind. Just two tall white spirits glowing in the afterlight, and Elsa and I soaking it all in. On All Hallows' Eve, Christians honor and remember the saints, those who have passed before us. It seemed more fitting this evening, having just lost my dad and her grandpa 6 weeks ago. We drove home to Lincoln after a stop at Runza, happy with our success. The next morning I drove back and hiked in along the western shoreline using a game trail to a cedar tree that became my blind on a high bank about 300 yards away. I watched these white wonders wake up to dawn and shine like diamonds in the morning sun, with not another soul around, just us. As I write this now, 2H and his buddy are winging south into Kansas. I wonder where they will stop next.